ever feel like you're drowning in digital stuff? Like photos and videos and backups? Like, where do you even put it all?
Yeah, you start to think you need like a whole data center in your basement.
Right. And then there's that other problem. How do you keep all that in the cloud and, not go broke doing it?
It is a challenge, a big challenge for a lot of people.
Well, today we're going to dive deep into a pretty cool way to solve that, specifically with Azure Blob Storage.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about storage tiers.
Storage tiers, okay. So what exactly are those?
Well, imagine when you go to a concert, you got different seating options, right?
Okay, yeah.
The cheap seats are way in the back, nosebleed section, maybe not the best view.
Right.
But then you have like the middle section, a little bit more expensive.
A little closer to the action.
Yeah, and then there's those front row seats. Those are going to cost you a pretty penny.
Prime real estate.
Prime real estate. Azure kind of does the same thing with your data. Different tiers, different costs, different access.
Like different seating sections for your data. I like that.
Exactly. And we've actually got an article here called Optimizing Costs with Azure Blob Storage Tiers that explains it all.
Awesome. So basically, we're going to be talking about all the different options for storing your data.
So you can figure out the best strategy, where to put what, so you can access it when you need to without breaking the bank.
I love it. Let's get started with that front row experience, that hot tier.
Okay, so the hot tier. It's for data you access constantly, multiple times a day even. It's built for speed and reliability.
So if you need it now, it's there.
Exactly. Low latency, high throughput. Now, it's true, storing your data in the hot tier per gigabyte, it's going to be more expensive than the other options.
Right.
But the flip side is that accessing that data, whether you're reading it, writing to it, or just looking at the metadata, it's the cheapest way to go.
So you save on the access, but pay more for the storage. Interesting.
Yeah, and if you're constantly interacting with those files, those lower access costs really add up over time. Okay, I can see that. So would that be, like, if you're running a website with a ton of images and videos that people are constantly accessing?
Exactly. Like any application that's actively being used, where data is constantly being updated and accessed.
So that makes sense. Think like a
Right.
social media platform or something like that.
Yeah, or any collaboration platform where teams are working on shared documents. It's for that essential data.
Got it. So that's the hot tier, front row access. What about the data that's still important, but you don't need it every second?
That's where the cool tier comes in. Think of it as, those middle seats at the concert.
Okay, so still a good view.
Yeah, you access it less frequently, maybe once a month, maybe even less, but it's still readily available.
Gotcha. So what about the cost for that tier?
So the cost per gigabyte in the cool tier is lower than the hot tier, which is great if you have a lot of data that you don't need constantly.
That makes sense. You're not accessing it as much, so it should be cheaper to store. Exactly. But when you do need to access that data, it will cost a little more than the hot tier. So you save on storage, but pay a bit more when you need to use it.
It's a trade-off then.
It is. You're trading lower storage fees for potentially higher access fees.
Right. Anything else to keep in mind with the cool tier? Like, I feel like there was something about a minimum time you need to keep stuff there.
Oh, you're right. There's a minimum storage duration of 30 days for data in the cool tier.
Oh, okay.
So even if you upload something and then delete it after a week, you still get charged for the full 30 days.
So it's really designed for data you plan to keep for at least a month.
Exactly.
Okay, so when would you typically choose the cool tier? Give us some examples.
Okay, well, short-term backups are a good example.
Yes.
Think about backups you take regularly but don't need to restore very often.
Right. Just in case something goes wrong.
Exactly. Or maybe data for monthly reports. Stuff you need access to, but not every day.
Okay, I get it. So we've talked about front row seats and middle section seats. Now let's go further back in the venue. What about the cold tier?
The cold tier. That's for data you access rarely, but still want to be able to get to it relatively quickly when you need it.
So it's still accessible, just not as instantaneous as the other tiers.
Right. Now, the storage cost for the cold tier is even lower than the cool tier, which makes it great for long-term storage of data you don't access often.
So you're really starting to save on storage costs at this point.
Yeah, but, you guessed it, the access costs are higher than both the hot and cool tiers. So you pay even less to store it, but more when you need to retrieve it.
So the trend continues. Cheaper storage, more expensive access.
Exactly. And there's a minimum storage duration for the cold tier as well.
What is it?
90 days.
Okay, 90 days. So 3 months minimum for cold. And what are some examples of data that would be good for the cold tier?
Think about long-term backups that you really hope you never need to restore.
Uh-huh.
Or maybe historical data that you need to keep for compliance but rarely access.
So important data, but not something you need to access frequently.
Got it. Exactly. It strikes a good balance between affordability and accessibility.
Okay, so we've gone from the front row to the middle section to the back of the venue. Now we're at the final tier, the archive tier. This is like the basement storage, right?
Yeah, you could say that. It's for data that you hardly ever access. Maybe once a year, maybe even less.
Like those boxes you put in the attic and forget about.
Exactly. And retrieval from the archive tier, it takes a while. We're talking hours, not minutes.
So accessibility is not a priority here.
Not really. It's about long-term, cost-effective storage.
So I'm guessing this is the cheapest tier in terms of storage costs.
It is the absolute cheapest, but it comes with the highest retrieval costs and that longer wait time. It's like taking something out of deep freeze. Takes a while to thaw out.
Right. And what's the minimum storage duration for the archive tier?
180 days, 6 months.
Okay, so 6 months minimum. What kind of data would you typically put in the archive tier?
Regulatory archives are a good example. Businesses have to keep certain records for years, but they rarely need to access them.
Makes sense. Anything else?
Long-term data retention, maybe for historical purposes. Data you need to keep, but don't expect to access often.
Okay, so we've covered the entire spectrum of storage tiers. It seems like the key takeaway is knowing how often you need to access your data and how quickly you need it.
That's exactly it. If you need it quickly and frequently, you're looking at higher storage costs and lower access costs.
And as you go towards less frequent access, storage costs go down, but access costs and retrieval times go up.
Precisely. And don't forget those minimum storage durations for the cool, cold, and archive tiers. 30, 90, and 180 days, respectively.
Right. So it's not just about how often you access the data, but also how long you need to keep it.
Exactly. It's all about finding that sweet spot between cost and accessibility.
So for all of you listening out there, think about your own digital world. What data do you have that needs to be in the front row, ready to go at a moment's notice?
And what can you afford to put in the back, knowing that it might take a little longer to retrieve?
Maybe you have some old backups or archives that could be moved to a colder tier.
Now that you know about these different tiers, it opens up a lot of possibilities for managing your data. You could even set up rules to automatically move data between tiers based on how old it is or how often you access it.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
So we encourage you to explore these options, see what works best for you, maybe experiment with moving some data around and see how it affects your costs. It's all about finding that perfect balance.
Yeah, and who knows, maybe you'll discover some creative new strategies for managing your data.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Azure Blob Storage tiers. Until next time, happy storing.
Happy storing.